I was heavily pregnant, sitting upright on the edge of the neatly made bed in my deep blue satin gown, when my husband Park Ji-sung walked into our luxury bedroom with Kim Yura and said, "Nadia, get up. Yura has had a long day, go make us something to eat." He looked at me with cold authority, thinking I was too vulnerable, too weighed down by the child I carried to put up a fight. What Ji-sung didn't know, and what his new lover was about to learn the hard way, was that the compliant wife he had been treating like an afterthought was actually the only heiress to Kwon Tae-sung, the ruthless patriarch of a global mafia syndicate. And in my bloodline, disrespect isn't just a mistake, it's a death sentence. Before we dive into this story of ultimate betrayal and revenge, if you love seeing arrogant husbands and their mistresses get exactly what's coming to them, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me how you'd handle Kim Yura, and subscribe so you never miss a tale of sweet, cold-blooded payback. Now, let's begin. My name is Nadia Stewart, and I made a fatal miscalculation. I fell for a man who looked at my cultivated peace and mistook it for weakness. Not long ago, I was the kind of woman who didn't flinch at the sight of a drawn weapon. But then came Ji-sung. He offered me the illusion of a quiet life, a chance to step out from under the heavy shadow of my father's empire. I left the syndicate, completely ignoring Kwon Tae-sung's final warning. Men like him don't want to love a queen, Nadia. They only want the thrill of chaining one. I didn't listen. I married him, got pregnant, and watched the man of my dreams curdle into a tyrant who viewed my swelling belly as a burden rather than a blessing. I sat perfectly still under the cool, cinematic lighting of our bedroom, the deep blue satin draping smoothly over my baby bump. At this stage in my pregnancy, my posture was composed and steady, my hand resting gently over my child to feel its faint movements. Behind me on the wall hung a framed crest, a quiet, constant reminder of the legacy and wealth I was born into. On the wooden dresser a few feet away, my black briefcase sat slightly open, the dull mat of a handgun case peeking through. 4 years, I had traded my father's ruthless world for this silent domesticity. I thought I had built a sanctuary. Then, the bedroom door swung open, shattering the quiet. Ji-sung stood in the doorway, stiff and serious in his tailored blue suit, his expression laced with an unwarranted arrogance. Standing entirely too close to him was Kim Yura in a striking red dress, her hand resting brazenly on his chest. Her posture was confident, but her eyes darted around my sanctuary with cautious greed. And in the dim hallway behind them, I noticed the faint silhouette of a suited figure, a quiet suspense settling over the room. "Nadia, get up," Ji-sung commanded, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once won me over. "Yura is hungry. Go to the kitchen and prepare us something to eat. We need the room." I didn't flinch. I remained seated, my expression calm, controlled, and quietly intense as I stared back at them. The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air, a profound insult to the heiress sitting before him. Beside him, Yura offered a condescending smirk. "Don't rush her, Ji-sung," she murmured softly, her tone dripping with false pity. "She looks like she struggles just to stand." Inside, my pulse slowed. My eyes drifted from the two fools in the doorway toward the half-open briefcase on the dresser. The dormant predator was finally waking up. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating. A normal woman might have wept. A normal wife might have screamed, hurled the nearest luxury lamp, or begged for an explanation as to why a stranger was brazenly standing in her private sanctuary. But I was not a normal woman, and the blood that pumped through my veins was anything but ordinary. I remained perfectly still on the edge of the mattress. The deep blue satin of my gown pooled around my thighs, the fabric cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the sudden, quiet heat igniting in my chest. Beneath my resting palm, my baby shifted, a gentle, fluttering kick that anchored me to the present. Patience, I reminded myself. Watch them. Let them play their hands. Did you not hear me, Nadia? Ji-sung sighed, the sound laced with a practiced, theatrical exhaustion. He loosened his silk tie, stepping further into the room as if he owned every shadow within it. Yura has been on her feet all day. Be useful for once. The kitchen is downstairs. He didn't even look at me when he said it. His eyes were already roaming the expansive suite, assessing the plush furnishings and the sweeping skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was comfortable. Too comfortable. He had spent the last 2 years convincing himself that the gentle, accommodating woman he married was the absolute extent of my existence. He had entirely forgotten, or perhaps in his toxic arrogance, willfully ignored, the framed crest mounted on the wall just above my head. The silver and onyx emblem of the Kwan family. My gaze shifted to Yura. She was leaning against the doorframe now, her striking red dress a vulgar splash of color in my carefully curated cool-toned space. Her lips curved into a smug, victorious little smile. She looked at my swollen belly, her eyes filled with mock pity, before her gaze lazily dragged across the room and landed on the half-open black briefcase resting on the dresser. She probably thought it held maternity documents or ultrasound photos. She had no idea that beneath the leather flap lay a custom-fitted, suppressed handgun. I calculated the distance in my head. 8 feet to the dresser. 3 seconds to unlatch the case, chamber around, and put a bullet exactly between Yura's heavily mascaraed eyes. 2 more seconds to pivot and shatter Jisung's kneecaps. The math was deeply comforting. It was the language of my childhood, the brutal lullabies my father taught me before I ever learned to ride a bike. "I'm not cooking for you, Jisung," I finally said. My voice was eerily calm, a smooth, glassy surface hiding a dark, bottomless trench. Jisung frowned, his jaw tightening in irritation that I hadn't immediately scrambled to fulfill his humiliating request. "It wasn't a question," he snapped. I slowly stood up, letting the blue satin cascade gracefully to the floor. I didn't reach for the briefcase. Not yet. I just looked at him, feeling the dormant predator within me finally uncoil. As I stood there, the silk sliding against my skin, I stared into the face of the man I had traded my very nature to protect. 2 years ago, I was the apex predator in my father's syndicate. I was the whisper in the dark, the invisible hand that carried out Kwan Taesung's most ruthless decrees. But the violence had a cost, a slow erosion of the soul that I only fully recognized when I began to dream of becoming a mother. I didn't want my child's first lullaby to be the sound of shattered glass, nor did I want them inheriting a throne built on a foundation of bone. I wanted the one thing my father's immense wealth could never buy, a boring, ordinary life. Then I met Park Jisung. He was handsome, ambitious, and aggressively ordinary. He didn't smell of gunpowder or paranoia. He smelled of expensive cologne and corporate ambition. To him, I wasn't the feared Mafia heiress. I was just Nadia, a quiet, beautiful woman with a vague, wealthy background. My father had warned me the day I packed my bags to leave the compound. He had stood by the heavy oak doors of his study, his eyes dark with a mixture of sorrow and hard-won wisdom. A tiger cannot survive on a diet of grass, Nadia, he had told me, his voice a low rumble. And a man who demands you clip your claws does not love you. He only wants to ensure you cannot fight back when he decides to break you. But I was desperate for the lie. I chose the grass. I chose this sprawling, pristine estate, the mindless charity galas, and the quiet evenings waiting for my husband to come home. I methodically broke myself down to fit into the small, fragile box Jisung's ego required. I hid my lethal martial training behind prenatal yoga classes. I replaced the cold, assessing stare of a syndicate boss with the warm, pliant smile of a trophy wife. When his initial business ventures teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, I secretly funneled millions of my family's untraceable assets into his accounts, building him a financial empire from the shadows just so he could feel like a self-made king. I made myself artificially weak so he could feel strong. I gave him the world, and in return, I only asked for the safety of a faithful home. And this was my reward. Looking at Jisung now, his chest puffed out in indignant defense of a woman who wasn't worth the cost of the bullet it would take to end her, the thick fog of my delusion finally evaporated. I had starved the tiger for 2 years, convincing myself that the docile woman in the mirror was real. But as Yura's mocking gaze swept over my pregnant frame, I realized my father had been entirely right. The peace I had built was nothing but a fragile, pathetic lie. And the lie was officially over. My gaze drifted from Jisung's irritated frown, bypassing Yura's arrogant smirk, and settled entirely on the wooden dresser. Sitting there, nestled between a stack of folded pastel baby blankets and a silver-framed ultrasound photo, was the black leather briefcase. It was a jarring contradiction to the soft, maternal sanctuary I had tried so desperately to curate. Yet, at this precise moment, It was the only thing in the room that made any sense. The case was slightly ajar, the dual silver clasps undone. I had opened it earlier that afternoon, running my fingers over the custom-molded foam and the cold matte steel of the suppressed 9mm nestled within. It was a wedding gift from my father, disguised as a family heirloom. For the days when your husband forgets who holds the leash, Kwon Tae-sung had murmured, pressing the heavy leather into my hands on the day I left the compound. I had locked it away, disgusted by his cynicism, convinced I would never need it. Now, looking at the sliver of dark metal visible through the gap, I felt a profound sense of homecoming. The briefcase wasn't just a container for a weapon, it was a mirror. For 2 years, I had looked at my reflection and seen Park Ji-sung's devoted, mild-mannered wife. But the leather case demanded I remember the truth. I was the woman who had orchestrated the hostile takeover of the Busan ports at 22. I was the phantom who had dismantled a rival cartel's leadership without leaving a single fingerprint. I was the sole heir to the Kwon Syndicate, a bloodline forged in fire and absolute authority. I felt a strange, intoxicating calm wash over me. The suffocating weight of playing the submissive wife lifted, replaced by the familiar, icy precision of my upbringing. The tiger wasn't just awake, it was hungry. "Are you deaf, Nadia?" Ji-sung's voice cut through the heavy silence, sharp and grating. He took another step toward me, misreading my stillness for shock or despair. "I told you to go downstairs. Stop being difficult. Yura is a guest in this house, and you will treat her with the proper respect." Respect. The word echoed in the quiet room, a tragic, laughable irony. I didn't blink. I didn't cry. I simply shifted my weight, feeling the satisfying, grounded strength in my legs despite the heavy curve of my pregnancy. My eyes remained locked on the briefcase for one final, lingering second, making a silent promise to the steel inside, before I slowly turned my attention fully back to my husband. The woman who had loved him, who had compromised her very soul to build his fragile ego, was dead. And the heiress standing in her place was already calculating exactly how to tear his stolen empire to the ground. Ji-sung let out a sharp, exasperated breath, misinterpreting my deliberate silence as the stubborn, pathetic pout of a helpless wife. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly over the velvet armchair near the window. Every movement he made was deliberately expansive, a pathetic display of dominance in a room he only occupied because I had secretly paid the mortgage. "Don't look at me like that, Nadia," he sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You're making this much more dramatic than it needs to be. Men have needs. You've been... well, look at you." He gestured vaguely toward my swollen stomach, his lip curling in a micro-expression of distaste. "You're tired all the time. You've completely let yourself go. I need someone who actually has the energy to keep up with my lifestyle." Beside him, Yura practically purred, adjusting her posture to further emphasize the sleek fit of her red dress. She rested her chin on his shoulder, playing the part of the adored prize perfectly. "I'm the one out there grinding every single day," Ji-sung continued, his voice rising with a fabricated sense of righteous indignation. "I built the company. I put this roof over your head. I buy the expensive silk gowns you lounge around in all day doing absolutely nothing." He stepped closer, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate a woman who had once snapped a grown man's collarbone with a single, sweeping kick. "You should be grateful I haven't filed for divorce. I'm generous enough to keep you comfortable while you carry the baby. The least you can do is show a little hospitality to the woman who actually makes me happy." I let his words wash over me. A month ago, his cruel dismissal would have shattered my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. I would have wept, begged, and internalized every poisonous syllable. But now, staring into his dark eyes, I felt absolutely nothing but a clinical, chilling detachment. I wasn't looking at my husband anymore, I was looking at a target. I mapped the exposed pulse point at his throat, the vulnerable hinge of his jaw, the arrogant thrust of his chest. He was entirely unguarded, standing mere inches away from a predator he firmly believed was a harmless house cat. "So let's drop the pathetic silent treatment," Ji-sung snapped, flicking his fingers dismissively in front of my face as if shooing away an annoying insect. "Go downstairs. Make dinner. And when you're done, clear your personal items out of the master bath. Yura will be staying in here with me from now on. The guest room down the hall is better suited for your condition anyway. He turned his back on me then, offering me his unprotected spine, entirely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own death warrant. With Jisung's back turned, shuffling carelessly through his walk-in closet for a more comfortable shirt, the space belonged momentarily to Yura and me. She took a slow, deliberate step deeper into the bedroom, her stiletto heels sinking into the plush cream carpet I had hand-selected from Milan. As she moved, a wave of her perfume washed over me, a cloying, aggressively sweet floral scent that clawed at the back of my throat. It was the scent of desperation, a cheap imitation masquerading as luxury. The stench of betrayal was suddenly very literal, poisoning the cool, crisp air of my sanctuary. Yura ran her manicured fingers along the edge of my mahogany vanity, her eyes alight with the thrill of a scavenger claiming an abandoned nest. She paused by a silver tray holding my pearl earrings, offering a soft, condescending cluck of her tongue. "He really is a good man, you know," Yura said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, faux sympathetic whisper. She tilted her head, giving me a look that was meant to convey pity but only magnified her staggering ignorance. "You shouldn't make him so angry. He's under a lot of pressure, building this incredible life for you. The least you could do is make it easy for him to transition." I watched the way her throat moved as she spoke, noting the fragile, unprotected line of her trachea exposed above the scooped neckline of her red dress. In my father's world, women like Yura rarely survived their first miscalculation. They were loud, careless, and blinded by shiny things, completely oblivious to the quiet shadows that held the actual power. "I know it hurts," she continued, clearly emboldened by my silence. She misread my icy composure as utter defeat. Sauntering closer, she stopped just out of arm's reach, her gaze dropping pointedly to the curve of my stomach. "But you have the baby to think about now. You don't want to cause Jisung any unnecessary stress. Just go downstairs, Nadia. Let's be mature about this. It's my room now." She genuinely believed she had one. She looked at Park Jisung, a man drowning in my family's hidden money, a hollow figurehead propped up entirely by my silent orchestration, and saw a king. She looked at me, the architect of his entire existence, and saw a discarded peasant. The absolute, flawless comedy of her delusion almost made me smile. She reached out her hand, as if to pat my shoulder in a sickening gesture of mocking comfort. Every instinct hammered into my bones over 20 years screamed at me to catch her outstretched wrist, snap the delicate radius bone, and use her own momentum to drive her face first into the hardwood floor. It would take less than a second. But I held my ground, letting her fingers stop mere inches from my gown before she thought better of it and pulled away. The time for impulsive violence had passed. I wanted them to feel the full, crushing weight of their mistake when the walls finally closed in. I let the silence stretch until it became a physical weight in the room. A lesser woman would have filled the void with screaming, pleading, or the pathetic shattering of porcelain. But in the Kwon family, we were taught that noise was a symptom of weakness. Power, absolute and terrifying, never needed to announce itself. It simply waited. I kept my hands resting gently over my swollen belly, feeling the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. It was a slow, measured thumping, utterly devoid of the panic Jisung so desperately wanted to see. Every second I remained quiet was a drop of poison in the atmosphere, thickening the air with a tension neither of them was equipped to understand. Jisung emerged from the walk-in closet, buttoning the cuffs of a crisp, casual shirt. He paused when he saw I hadn't moved toward the door. The smug satisfaction on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. He couldn't read me. For 2 years, he had been an expert at manipulating my manufactured fragility, but the woman looking back at him now was a complete stranger. My eyes were flat, dark, and entirely empty of the blind devotion that used to fuel his pathetic ego. "Are you just going to stand there staring?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the sharp, authoritative edge of his earlier commands. He crossed his arms, trying to physically close himself off from the sudden, inexplicable drop in the room's temperature. Yura shifted uncomfortably, the brazen confidence from moments ago suddenly feeling brittle. She glanced between us, her shallow intuition finally picking up on the fact that something was horribly wrong with this picture. A cornered, heartbroken wife was supposed to cower or cry. I was standing perfectly still, like an executioner waiting for the official order. My silence wasn't a retreat. It was a highly calculated siege. I was mapping out the exact coordinates of their ruin. If I reached for the briefcase and ended them now, it would be over in seconds. It would be messy, visceral, and ultimately unsatisfying. They needed to lose everything. Jisung needed to watch his borrowed empire crumble to ash before he ever felt the physical pain of my vengeance. He needed to realize that the woman he discarded was the only thing holding up the sky above his head. I took a slow, deep breath, locking the violent storm securely behind my ribs. The tiger would feed, but not on cheap scraps. Without uttering a single syllable, I turned my back on them. I walked toward the bedroom door with a steady, measured grace, the blue satin sweeping silently across the hardwood floor. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. I simply exited the sanctuary I had built for him, leaving them alone in the quiet, completely unaware that the silence they thought they had conquered was actually the sound of a ticking bomb. I had barely reached the landing of the sweeping glass staircase when I heard the heavy, irritated thud of his footsteps behind me. Park Ji-sung was a man who required the final word. My quiet departure hadn't satisfied the script he had written in his head. He needed me broken, weeping, and verbally compliant to truly validate his ego. "Walk away from me again, Nadia, and see what happens," he barked, his voice echoing sharply against the high ceilings of the foyer. I paused, my hand resting lightly on the cold steel of the banister, but I didn't turn around. He closed the distance between us, his fingers wrapping roughly around my upper arm. It was a firm, bruising grip, meant to physically assert the dominance he felt slipping away. That single touch, uninvited, aggressive, and entirely foolish, was the final nail in his coffin. In the Kwon Syndicate, men had been dismantled piece by piece for merely looking at me with that level of disrespect. "You're not listening to me," Ji-sung hissed, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive scotch he had poured himself earlier. "You think you can just shut down and freeze me out? Let me make this crystal clear for you, since your hormones seem to be clouding your judgment. You will go to that kitchen, and you will make Yura feel welcome. You will accept this new dynamic, or I will end you." I slowly turned my head, locking my dark, empty eyes onto his flushed face. He mistook my stillness for fear and pressed his advantage, his chest puffing with borrowed authority. "If you try to fight me on this, I will freeze every credit card in your name. I will lock you out of this house. You have no job, no family to run back to, and absolutely nothing to your name. If you push me, I will divorce you, leave you on the street, and I will take the baby. Do you understand me? You only eat, sleep, and breathe because I allow it." The sheer, breathtaking irony of his threat hung in the air between us. He was threatening to strip me of the very wealth I had secretly funneled into his accounts. He was threatening to take a child that carried the bloodline of the most lethal Mafia patriarch in Asia. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I committed the pressure of his fingers to memory, calculating exactly how much force it would take to shatter his wrist when the time came. "I understand completely, Ji-sung," I said, my voice smooth as glass, betraying absolutely none of the violence churning beneath my skin. He let go of my arm with a scoff of triumph, satisfied that he had finally put me in my place. "Good. Then get to work." As he turned and marched confidently back up the stairs to his waiting mistress, I reached into the pocket of my silk gown. It was time to make a phone call. I didn't go to the kitchen to cook. I walked past the gleaming marble countertops and stepped into the darkened walk-in pantry, quietly closing the heavy oak door behind me. The silence here was absolute, thick with the scent of aged spices and imported teas. I reached into the depths of a high cabinet, my fingers brushing past rows of pristine jars until I found the false back. Behind the wooden panel lay a small, matte black satellite phone. It had remained untouched for 2 years, resting in the dark like a venomous snake in hibernation. I powered it on. The screen flickered to life, casting a cold, sterile glow over my face. I didn't need to dial a number. The device was hardwired to a single, encrypted frequency that bounced across a dozen private servers before reaching the impenetrable heart of the Kwon Syndicate in Seoul. I pressed the call button. It rang only once. I wondered how long it would take for the grass to lose its taste. A low, gravelly voice answered. Kwon Tae-sung didn't deal in pleasantries or surprise. He sounded exactly as I remembered. a man whose every exhaled breath carried the crushing weight of an underworld empire. "You were right, father," I said softly, the admission tasting like copper in my mouth. "The tiger is starving." A heavy, terrifying pause stretched across the encrypted line. When he spoke again, any faint edge of fatherly sorrow had vanished, replaced entirely by the chilling, absolute authority of a patriarch whose bloodline had been disrespected. "Has he harmed you?" "He grabbed my arm," I replied, my voice perfectly steady as I looked down at the faint red marks blossoming on my skin. "And he brought a woman into my home. Into my sanctuary. He threatened to take my child." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of a death sentence being drafted, signed, and sealed. In our world, the Quan name was synonymous with disproportionate retribution. A man who insulted our family lost a limb. A man who threatened the sole heiress and her unborn child would be systematically erased from the earth. "Where is the rat now?" Taesung asked, the absolute ice in his tone capable of freezing the blood in Jisung's veins if he could only hear it. "Upstairs. Playing king in a castle we bought him." "And the borrowed empire?" "Burn it," I commanded, feeling the last fragile thread of my old life sever completely. "Liquidate the shell companies. Pull the dummy investors. Freeze every account. I want him holding ashes before the night is over." "Consider it done," my father rumbled, a dark, primal satisfaction finally creeping into his tone. "My elite squad is already mobilizing. The enforcers will be at your location in 10 minutes. Secure yourself, Nadia." "I am always secure," I murmured. I ended the call, slipping the black phone into the pocket of my satin gown. The docile, helpless wife was dead. I stepped out of the shadows and back into the cool light of the kitchen, ready to watch my husband's world end. I stepped out of the pantry, the heavy oak door clicking softly shut behind me, sealing away the last remnants of the woman I had pretended to be. As I walked back through the sprawling, meticulously designed kitchen, I ran a hand along the cool marble island. Jisung loved this house. He loved to boast at dinner parties about how his relentless work ethic and brilliant business acumen had afforded us this architectural marvel in the city's most exclusive district. He genuinely believed he was a self-made king. The truth, however, was a masterclass in financial manipulation that I had orchestrated from this very kitchen island while sipping decaf tea. 2 years ago, Park Jisung was a struggling developer drowning in high-interest loans, a man with grand visions and absolutely no capital. He was desperate, bleeding money, and on the verge of total collapse when we first met. To protect his fragile pride, I never offered him a dime directly. Instead, I made a few quiet calls. Within weeks, his toxic debts were miraculously bought out by a nameless overseas conglomerate. Anonymous angel investors suddenly flooded his startups with capital. Rival firms that had previously blocked his zoning permits abruptly withdrew their bids, terrified into submission by polite but devastating visits from men in unmarked suits. I didn't just support his dreams, I paved his entire world in gold and handed him the crown, also he could feel like the man he so desperately wanted to be. Every brick of this house, every tailored stitch of the blue suit he wore, every drop of the expensive scotch he was currently drinking with his mistress, it was all funded by the Quan Syndicate's shadow accounts. And with a single 10-second phone call, I had just turned it all to dust. As I reached the bottom of the glass staircase, the tense silence of the house was violently punctured by the shrill ringing of a cell phone from the master suite above. It was followed almost immediately by a second ring, a different phone. Then, the faint, rapid pinging of urgent email notifications began echoing down the hallway. I paused at the first step, resting my hand on the steel banister, and tilted my head upward. "What do you mean, Frozen?" Jisung's voice barked from the second floor. The arrogant, dismissive drawl he had used on me mere minutes ago was entirely stripped away, replaced by the breathless, rising panic of a man stepping off a ledge in the dark. "Check it again. That's my primary corporate account. The bank can't just..." A heavy pause. A muffled, desperate curse. "Liquidated? By who?" He practically screamed into the receiver. I smiled. It was a small, cold thing, a ghost of a curve on my lips that didn't reach my dark eyes. The collapse was happening at the speed of light. The shell companies were dissolving, the phantom investors were pulling out, and the banks, loyal only to my father's invisible hand, were locking Jisung out of his own life. The burrowed empire was falling, and I began the slow ascent upstairs to watch the ruins burn. As I reached the top of the glass staircase, Jisung's frantic shouting echoed from the master suite. "Call the Cayman branch. Do it now," he screamed into his phone, his voice cracking with a pathetic high-pitched desperation. I didn't care about his panic anymore. My attention had already shifted to something far more dangerous. The ambient hum of the estate's smart security system abruptly died. The subtle blue floor lights along the baseboards blinked out simultaneously, plunging the long, modern corridor into heavy, suffocating shadows. A civilian wouldn't have noticed the faint, muffled pft that sounded from the perimeter gates just seconds later, the distinct, polite cough of a suppressed weapon. But I was Kwon Taesung's daughter. I had spent my entire childhood learning the brutal symphony of an assassination. I stopped dead at the edge of the landing. The air pressure in the house shifted violently, a cold, unnatural draft sweeping up from the lower floor. Someone had breached the reinforced glass doors of the terrace. At the far end of the hallway, near the guest wing, the darkness seemed to detach itself from the walls. A silhouette materialized, the faint, suited figure I had sensed earlier, now moving with lethal, practiced silence. Then a second shadow joined it. They weren't common burglars looking to pawn my jewelry. Their footfalls were perfectly synchronized, their weapons held tight against their chests in a flawless close-quarters tactical formation. They were ghosts. A rival syndicate's hit squad. My father's enemies had finally tracked me down, undoubtedly sensing the vulnerability I had so foolishly projected to the world over the last 2 years. My pulse remained remarkably steady, adapting instantly to the adrenaline. The financial ruin I had just unleashed upon my husband was a cold, calculated execution, but this was pure, primal survival. I was standing in an open hallway in a trailing blue satin gown, entirely unarmed, and heavily pregnant. "Nadia!" Jisung yelled from the master bedroom doorway, stepping blindly into the corridor. His knuckles were white as he gripped his useless cell phone, his face pale and twisted in rage. "What did you do? The bank is saying my entire portfolio is." He froze. His rant died in his throat as his eyes finally adjusted to the dim light, catching the menacing glint of moonlight reflecting off a polished gun barrel down the hall. The shadows raised their weapons in unison, the laser sights cutting through the dark like crimson needles. I didn't have the time or the inclination to explain the bloody reality of my family's world to him. I had exactly 3 seconds to cross the remaining distance of the hallway, shove past my paralyzed husband, and reach the black leather briefcase resting on the bedroom dresser before the air filled with lead. The tiger was no longer just awake. It was cornered. The crimson laser sight danced across the breast of Jisung's tailored suit, settling just above his racing heart. For a microsecond, the hallway was suspended in absolute silence, the air thick with the metallic taste of impending violence. Then, the first shot tore through the dark. It wasn't the deafening roar of cinematic gunfire, but a lethal, suppressed crack that bit into the drywall mere inches from Jisung's ear. A cloud of white plaster exploded outward, raining down on his perfectly styled hair. The illusion of his immense power shattered instantly. The man who had spent the last 2 years demanding my submission let out a high, terrified shriek, his knees buckling as he dropped to the floor, uselessly covering his head with his trembling hands. I didn't scream. I didn't freeze. The adrenaline hit my bloodstream like ice water, awakening every dormant combat instinct Kwon Taesung had drilled into my bones. I moved with a sudden, explosive speed that completely defied the heavy 7-month curve of my stomach. Grabbing Jisung by the collar of his ruined suit, I forcefully yanked him backward, hauling his dead weight out of the doorway. He was nothing more than an obstacle, a fleshy barrier standing between me and my survival. I shoved him violently into the master suite, stepping in right behind him just as a second suppressed round splintered the heavy oak doorframe exactly where my head had just been. Chaos violently erupted inside the luxury bedroom. The sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows suddenly imploded in a spectacular shower of tempered glass as a second shooter from the exterior terrace laid down, suppressing fire. The cool, atmospheric lighting short-circuited, plunging my carefully curated sanctuary into a strobing, terrifying twilight. Near the tufted bed, Yura dropped to her knees, screaming hysterically. She clamped her hands over her ears, her striking red dress covered in shimmering shards of broken glass. She was entirely paralyzed, weeping uncontrollably as the reality of my world violently crashed into her shallow existence. Jisung was equally pathetic, scrambling blindly across the carpet toward the master bathroom like a terrified child, abandoning his pregnant wife without a single backward glance. I ignored them both. My focus tunneled, narrowing down to the wooden dresser sitting 10 feet away. I kept low, one hand protectively cradling my belly, the deep blue satin of my gown snagging and tearing on the debris-littered floor. Another bullet tore through the mattress, sending white feathers drifting through the air like snow, but I didn't break my stride. I reached the dresser, my fingers slamming onto the leather of the black briefcase. I flipped the dual silver clasps. They popped open with a satisfying, heavy click. As the bedroom door was violently kicked open by the first encroaching shadow, my hand slipped beneath the foam and wrapped around the cold, textured grip of the suppressed 9mm. The metal felt exactly like an old friend. I pulled the weapon free, my thumb sweeping the safety off in one fluid, practiced motion, and turned to face the doorway. The silhouette in the doorway leveled his weapon, his masked face turning toward me. I squared my stance, the grip of the 9mm flush against my palm, the sights aligned perfectly with the center of his chest. I began the slow, deliberate squeeze of the trigger, prepared to end his life before he could take a breath. But I didn't have to. Before my firing pin could strike, a sickening, wet thud echoed from the hallway. The assassin stiffened violently. A dark blossom of crimson exploded from the front of his throat, painting the shattered doorframe. He collapsed forward like a puppet with severed strings, his weapon clattering uselessly onto the hardwood floor. Over his twitching body stepped a man in a flawless, charcoal gray suit, holding a suppressed tactical rifle. He was not alone. Behind him, the hallway was suddenly flooded with shadows of a different breed. My father's enforcers had arrived. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, a silent tide of black Kevlar and tailored wool sweeping through the shattered house. They didn't shout commands or scramble for cover like the rival hit squad. They operated with the cold, surgical precision of a scalpel cutting through diseased tissue. 2 more enforcers breached the master suite, stepping effortlessly over the dead assassin in the doorway. They moved past me without a single glance, their weapons raised as they advanced on the shattered terrace windows. A brief, violent flurry of suppressed gunfire erupted outside, 3 sharp cracks followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the patio stones. Then, absolute silence returned to the perimeter. The immediate threat was neutralized in less than 40 seconds. The man in the charcoal suit lowered his rifle and stepped fully into the luxury bedroom, his polished leather shoes crunching softly over the broken glass. It was Han, my father's most trusted lieutenant, a man whose reputation in the underworld was written entirely in blood. He surveyed the ruined sanctuary, his eyes briefly sweeping over Yura, who was hyperventilating in a fetal position by the bed, and the master bathroom door, where Jisung's muffled, pathetic sobbing could still be heard. Han's expression remained utterly blank, a mask of stone. He turned his attention to me, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and dropped into a deep formal bow, bending at a flawless 90-degree angle. Heiress, Han's deep voice resonated through the destroyed room, carrying the full, crushing weight of the Quan Syndicate's authority. The perimeter is secure. The patriarch sends his regards, and his apologies for the mess. I slowly lowered my 9mm, the cold steel resting against the side of my blue satin gown. I looked at the dead man bleeding out onto my imported cream carpet, then at the elite squad of killers standing at unwavering attention before me. The illusion of my ordinary life was completely dead and buried. I didn't need to hide anymore. The heiress had returned, and her army was here to escort her home. The ringing in my ears slowly faded, replaced by the sickening, metallic scent of fresh blood and the soft crunch of broken tempered glass settling on the carpet. The master suite, once a pristine monument to Park Ji-sung's inflated ego, was now a graveyard. From behind the frosted glass door of the en-suite bathroom, the muffled wet sounds of my husband's weeping drifted into the open room. It was a pathetic, rhythmic gasping, the sound of a man who had completely fractured under the weight of real terror. Near the bed, Yura was still curled in a tight ball, her hands clamped over her head as she whimpered into the ruined cream fibers. They were both utterly paralyzed by a world they had never been meant to see. I didn't holster my weapon. I kept the suppressed 9mm resting comfortably against my side, the cold steel grounding me. Han shifted his weight, his dark eyes flicking toward the bathroom door. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to one of his enforcers to retrieve the coward, but I raised a single finger, stopping the man in his tracks. This was my house. This was my mess to clean. Jisung, I called out. My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a sharp, carrying absolute authority that cut through the silence like a freshly honed blade. The weeping hitched. A long, agonizing pause stretched through the destroyed bedroom. Slowly, the bathroom door creaked open. Jisung crawled out on his hands and knees. The tailored blue suit he had worn like a king's armor just 10 minutes ago was now hopelessly wrinkled, smeared with white plaster dust and dark streaks of grime. His hair was plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. He looked exactly like what he was, a cornered rat. His tear-streaked face snapped up, his wide bloodshot eyes desperately scanning the room. He saw the dead assassin bleeding out near the doorway. He saw the towering, terrifying presence of Han and the enforcers, their lethal weapons lowered but ready. And then, his gaze finally found me. I was standing perfectly upright amidst the carnage, the deep blue satin of my gown catching the strobing emergency lights from outside. He looked at the heavy, customized firearm held effortlessly in my hand, my finger resting lightly just outside the trigger guard with expert familiarity. Nadia. He stammered, his voice barely a raw whisper. The police. Who are these men? He looked at Han, desperate for an ally, but my lieutenant offered him a stare so entirely devoid of humanity that Jisung physically recoiled. His panicked gaze darted back to me, then to the heavy black briefcase on the dresser, and finally up to the silver and onyx Quan family crest mounted on the wall. I watched the cognitive gears painfully lock into place behind his eyes. The frozen bank accounts. The sudden liquidation of his life's work. The arrival of a highly trained hit squad, followed instantly by a private army that bowed to his helpless pregnant wife. You. He breathed, his chest heaving as the horrifying, impossible truth finally shattered his delusion. Who are you? I didn't answer. I just looked down at the pathetic, trembling man who had tried to banish me to the guest room. He was finally realizing that he had never possessed an ounce of actual power. He had only been borrowing mine. The realization in Jisung's eyes was absolute, a fragile glass palace shattering into dust. But before the suffocating weight of his new reality could fully set in, the deceptive quiet of the room was broken by the sharp scrape of Kevlar against hardwood. Near the shattered remains of the floor-to-ceiling windows, one of the downed assassins, a man Han's squad had dropped onto the terrace, twitched. He hadn't been killed, the enforcer's suppressed round had only shattered his collarbone. Driven by the fanatical desperation of a failed hit, the man dragged himself over the threshold, his blood smearing across the broken glass. His trembling hand rose, gripping a secondary holdout pistol. And his laser sight wasn't aimed at Han or the enforcers. It was pointed directly at the swell of my stomach. Heiress. Han barked, stepping forward to intercept, his rifle snapping up, but his angle was blocked by the heavy oak frame of the bed. I didn't wait for my father's men to protect me. I didn't scream, and I didn't retreat. The maternal instinct that had driven me to seek a peaceful life was the exact same instinct that now demanded absolute, unforgiving violence. In one fluid, mechanically perfect motion, I raised the suppressed 9mm. I didn't look at the man's masked face, I looked at the lethal geometry of the threat. The heavy weapon felt like an extension of my own arm, the recoil a familiar, comforting punch against my palm as I squeezed the trigger. Thwack! The suppressed round hit him flawlessly. His head snapped back with a sickening crack, the holdout pistol slipping from his dead fingers before he could even tighten his grip. He slumped fully onto the carpet, his life extinguishing in a fraction of a second. A suffocating silence slammed back into the room, broken only by the sharp, metallic clatter of my spent casing bouncing across the hardwood floor. I kept my weapon raised for 2 full seconds, my breathing slow and entirely controlled. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. I slowly lowered the barrel, my left hand instinctively resting back over my womb. Beneath the ruined blue satin, I felt a faint, reassuring flutter. My child was safe. The Quan bloodline remained unbroken. I turned my dark, empty gaze back to Jisung. He had scrambled backward until his spine hit the vanity, his hands clamped over his mouth to stifle a hysterical, terrified scream. He was staring at the fresh corpse, then at the barrel of my gun, his mind violently rejecting the reality of what he had just witnessed. The docile, tired wife he had mocked, belittled, and threatened to leave on the street only moments ago had just executed a cartel assassin with the icy, unblinking precision of a seasoned killer. You wanted me to go down to the kitchen, Jisung, I said, my voice completely devoid of adrenaline, offering him nothing but cold, absolute ruin. But I think we're done playing house. The acrid scent of cordite hung heavy in the ruined master suite, a bitter, metallic perfume completely masking the cloying sweetness Yura had brought into my home. I stood completely still amidst the wreckage. Around me, the peaceful sanctuary I had so meticulously curated over the last 2 years was unrecognizable. White feathers drifted slowly from the shredded mattress, settling over the shattered glass and the dark, pooling blood of the men who had come to end my bloodline. I looked down at the deep blue satin of my gown. The delicate hem was torn, speckled with a fine, dark mist of crimson from the close-range execution. It was a flawless, tragic metaphor for my marriage, a beautiful, expensive illusion that was now permanently stained by the violent reality of who I truly was. With a soft, mechanical click, I engaged the safety of the 9mm and held it out blindly. Han materialized at my side instantly, taking the heavy firearm from my grip with a deep, reverent bow. He gave a sharp hand signal to 2 of his enforcers, who immediately moved in to drag the lifeless bodies out onto the ruined terrace, quietly clearing the carnage from my immediate space. By the vanity, Jisung was hyperventilating. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed in absolute horror on the slick smear of blood left on the cream carpet. He scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the debris, violently desperate to put distance between himself and the woman he had promised to love and protect. Why you killed him, Jisung stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic high-pitched wheeze. He stared at me as if I were a demon that had just crawled out of his darkest nightmare. You didn't even blink. He aimed a weapon at my child, I replied, my voice as calm and level as if I were discussing a trivial change in the weather. In my family, we do not outsource our survival, Jisung. And we never hesitate. Near the foot of the bed, Yura let out a ragged, hysterical sob. She was crawling slowly toward the open door, her striking red dress coated in white plaster dust and grime. She looked up at me, her face streaked with ruined mascara and tears, completely stripped of the arrogant, mocking confidence she had worn just 20 minutes prior. She was staring at an apex predator, finally realizing she had wandered blindly into the tiger's cage and kicked it for fun. Please, Yura whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the syllable. Please don't kill me. I looked down at her, searching myself for any lingering trace of anger or jealousy. I found absolutely nothing but a profound, suffocating apathy. Kill you? I echoed softly, stepping over a piece of splintered oak to look down at her. You are utterly insignificant, Yura. You are nothing more than the cheap match my husband used to burn down his own life. I slowly turned my dark gaze back to Jisung, who was shivering against the wall. The immediate violence was over, but his true punishment was only just beginning. I stepped over the glittering remains of a shattered crystal lamp, closing the final few feet between myself and the man who was legally my husband. Park Jisung was pressed flat against the mahogany vanity, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between my calm face and the heavily armed enforcers flanking the doorway. He was completely out of moves. The banks had frozen his stolen wealth, his mistress was weeping on the floor, and the docile wife he had bullied was standing before him as a recognized queen of the underworld. Nadia, please, he choked out, the arrogance in his voice entirely replaced by a sickening, wet desperation. He held up his hands, palms facing outward in a pathetic gesture of surrender. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. The money. The business. We can fix this. You're my wife. You're carrying my child. Driven by some ingrained, toxic belief that he could still physically manipulate my emotions, Jisung made a fatal miscalculation. He lunged forward, his trembling fingers wrapping desperately around my forearm. It was the exact same bruising grip he had used on the staircase when he threatened to leave me out on the street. My reaction was instantaneous, driven entirely by lethal muscle memory. I didn't flinch or pull away. I simply rotated my arm, trapping his hand firmly against my body, and slammed the heel of my free palm directly into the exposed joint of his wrist with crushing, calculated force. The sound was a sharp, sickening crack that echoed violently over Yura's quiet sobbing. The radius bone snapped instantly under the concentrated pressure. Jisung let out a piercing, agonizing shriek. He dropped to his knees, cradling his mangled arm against his chest as the color completely drained from his face. He curled into a tight ball on the carpet, dry heaving from the shock of the sudden, explosive pain. I looked down at him, my expression perfectly smooth, and calmly brushed an invisible speck of dust from the sleeve of my blue satin gown. 2 years ago, before I starved my own nature to fit into your pathetic life, I shattered a man's arm simply because he brushed my shoulder without permission, I said, my voice cold and terrifyingly steady. You grabbed me on the stairs. You brought a stranger into my sanctuary. And you threatened the only heir to the Kwan syndicate. You are breathing right now only because I do not want the father of my child to be a corpse. Jisung groaned, his face pressed into the ruined carpet, unable to articulate a single word through his agony. Your accounts are erased. Your company is ash. This house belongs to my father, I continued, stepping back and turning my gaze away from him for the very last time. Enjoy your new reality, Jisung. It's exactly what you earned. I looked up at Han, who stood waiting with absolute obedience. Bring the cars around. We are leaving. The armored SUV glided smoothly down the winding driveway, leaving the shattered remains of the glass estate shrinking in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. Park Jisung and Kim Yura were already ghosts to me, trapped in the ash of a borrowed empire that I had effortlessly burned to the ground. The quiet, docile wife who had so desperately sought a normal life died on that cream carpet, and the woman sitting in the plush leather seat beside Lieutenant Han was someone entirely different. Hours later, the heavy iron gates of the Kwan family's primary compound in Seoul parted to receive us. The transition from the fragile, modern illusion of my marriage to the ancient, imposing reality of my bloodline was absolute. Armed guards lined the cobblestone drive, their heads bowing in synchronized, silent reverence as our convoy passed. This was not a house built on high-interest loans and fragile male ego. This was a fortress forged in blood, steel, and decades of absolute, terrifying authority. My father, Kwan Taesung, stood at the top of the grand stone steps. He wore a sharp, dark suit, his posture rigid and his eyes assessing. Behind him, carved into the massive oak doors of the manor, was the unmistakable silver and onyx emblem of our syndicate. As I stepped out of the vehicle, the cool night air biting at the torn, blood-speckled hem of my deep blue satin gown, Taesung's gaze swept over me. He didn't offer pity for my ruined marriage, nor did he ask if I was heartbroken. In our world, sentimentality was a fatal liability. He looked at the cold, empty expression on my face, the subtle shift in my posture, and saw exactly what he had been waiting 2 years to see, the return of his apex predator. The tiger is no longer starving, he murmured, his gravelly voice carrying a low, undeniable rumble of pride. It was the first time I had felt truly seen since the day I left. He stepped forward, placing a heavy, calloused hand on my shoulder. The gesture grounded me, anchoring my spirit back into the lethal, unforgiving soil of my family's legacy. The lineage is secure, father, I replied softly, meeting his gaze without a shadow of hesitation. I moved my hand to rest protectively over my swollen belly, feeling a strong, reassuring kick against my palm. This child would never be raised in the suffocating shadow of a coward's arrogance. They would never be taught to shrink themselves to make a weak man feel tall, or to bury their instincts for the sake of a pathetic illusion. They would be raised within these impenetrable walls, taught to rule with the exact same icy, unflinching precision that ran through their mother's veins. I looked up at the sprawling, heavily fortified compound that was once again my home. The lie of peace was finally over. The heir had returned, and the Kwan syndicate was whole once more.